Tribune and the Financial Times, and I thought that I was going to, I'd been sent to some incredible hellhole of corruption and mass murder. It turned out to be very different, the reality on the ground. And as time went by, I began to...
And I just don't mean to interrupt you, but just so our audience knows, you speak fluent Russian, you are half Russian. Your appreciation of Russian media comes from a completely different angle than maybe people who consume Western or Arab media.
True. For clarification, my mother is Russian, I'm 100% Emirati.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
But you speak Russian fluently.
I do speak Russian, yeah,
and
you know, some Russian blood helps me enter into, you know, the sort of inner circles.
Yeah.
And what I found very interesting was that I would be meeting with people and spending time with certain very sort of important individuals in Russia, and then I would read about them in the papers, and they would be described as Darth Vader, or you know, they'd have some kind of awful syndicate. And actually, these were really normal people with parents, with children, with friends, and who were really, you know, living normal lives. And so I became very aware of the way in which actually there are certain very powerful biases within the media. And
when you say the media, what do you mean by the media?
When I think of the media, I think specifically of those organizations in London and pretty much... well,
so you're saying the Western media has more biases than the Russian media?
You would be surprised at the variety of opinion that you will find in Russia, in the Russian language, on Russian TV. And I'm not saying that the Russian media is an example for the rest of the world, but I am saying that there are different perspectives.
Yeah.
And actually, my argument has always been that the West, Western Europe and the US would actually benefit much more from having a more nuanced understanding of the way Russia works. It is, you know, but the same press will talk about the Middle East and talk about authoritarian regimes, or they will talk about Gulf monarchies that are absolute monarchies. There's nothing absolute about anything here. There's nothing absolute about power. And you know, if they were to take a more interesting approach, they would find that power is diffused across systems.
Are you saying there's a double standard then? It sounds like that's what you're saying. That on the one hand, perhaps some Western media outlets will be critical or view critically some actions of some governments, but perhaps appear more favorable to others because they're more aligned with their government's strategic alliances.
You took the words out of my mouth. Yes. And I've spoken to a number of sort of political figures in Europe in particular about why Russia is continually demonized. And primarily not as in defense of Russia, but in order to be able to better interact with the Russians. You have to, I mean, in order to communicate with somebody, you can't cover them with dirt and then say, right, you know, what is your opinion of the situation in the Middle East? And so this continual denigration of Russia, I think, has led to negative outcomes in the region. It's also had an effect on policymakers within the region who consume this one-dimensional perspective and then use it actually in their interaction with the Russians on, you know, sort of
But isn't
and
it facts
else.
on the ground? I mean, isn't Russia, did Crimea not happen? Is Russia not aligned with the regime of Bashar al-Assad? Are these things untrue?
No, they are true. Absolutely, they are aligned with the. I think to say that they're now there's a difference between wanting to defend the institutions of the state and then what is usually presented as this kind of marriage of dictators between Putin and Assad. I mean that is not a real thing. That is a figment of people's imagination. And then you know you have sort of. Politicians in the UK saying that, you know, Putin, all it takes is one phone call and the issue will be settled. I mean, again, that is really misunderstanding or misrepresenting the true relationships.
You think it's a misunderstanding to say it would take one phone call from Russia to change the actions of certain regimes? You think that's a misunderstanding?
Yeah, absolutely. That's nonsense.
And why do you think then, in your view, that misrepresentation is perpetuated?
I think, I mean, on the Syria crisis, I think that, you know, many countries in the West are actually don't have the political appetite to do anything about it. And in a sense, it's pushing the can down the road and laying blame at somebody else's feet. From where I was sitting in Russia, I saw that actually the Russians were very interested in the Syrian question, that it wasn't a question necessarily of geopolitics. It is a question for them of political and radical Islam. And from my arrival in Moscow in 2008 until today, the key question has always been radical Islam and the threat from the south in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. And so again, to misrepresent what how Russia views the Middle East and to say that ISIS, for example, or radical Islam is not an issue is simply not true.
So from your perspective, from where you're sitting as the UAE ambassador to Moscow, Russia, specifically with regards to what's going on in Syria's main concern is radical Islam and not propping up the regime or maintaining its military alliance in a key area of the Middle East.
Propping up the regime is related to the question of extremist Islam. In a sense, you can't separate the two. And I think that may have even been part of the strategy of the regime. They do have a particular obsession about stability, whatever form of stability it is, as long as systems are stable. Genuine worry, can you hear me? Yes. They do have a genuine worry.
We have this just in case, by the way, I'm told, so no worries, everyone. All set up here.
You know, speaking to people at Google, 80% of the media that comes out of ISIS is in Arabic. The next language, 12%, is Russian.
Yeah.
You know,
sorry, what was that statistic? So 80% of all the media that comes out of ISIS is in Arabic, which makes sense.
The next
but 12%
is in Russian.
Is in Russian.
And then the percentages go down into, you know, the
That's interesting.
European. Yeah. So
that means English comes certainly third, I'm guessing, after Arabic.
You know, when I saw 80% Arabic and 12% Russian, it didn't really concern me what the other languages were, because these are the two languages that I work in, and it just made the issue of ISIS and the arc between, or the connection between Russia and the Arab world much more important than I think people really understand. So actually, we have a tremendous opportunity to work with the Russians on combating the extremism within the region, because, well, they are part of it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit, since we're at the Arab Media Forum, about Arab media. Now, since the creation of Al Jazeera, the media landscape has been completely revolutionized in this region in terms of news coverage. How do you see it in the last decade plus, in your estimation? How has Arab media transformed this part of the world?
Well, it certainly made it much more interesting to watch TV, I think. Before I entered government, I used to watch Al Jazeera, and I didn't really, maybe it was about 12, 15 years ago. It wasn't, I found it interesting because there were a lot of interesting debates. They were a little aggressive, and they reminded me of some of the more right-wing TV stations in the US. As time went by and I paid more attention to the nuances of the parameters of the debate, I began to understand that, things were being directed in a certain area. And I was shocked and sort of upset at the lack of depth that was taking place in the debate. So it was more of a show and a provocation than really trying to get to the heart of the issue. Over the last couple of years,
but it was a welcome addition to the landscape, considering really it was state-controlled outlets before. I mean, you really didn't have any even semblance of free, unrestricted, uncensored speech on television before.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah.
So then all of a sudden that happened. And
absolutely. Then you begin to see conversations that were taking place behind closed doors on TV. But I think that's actually led to a very interesting development with, for example, Sky News Arabia, where they've purposely gone out and tried to find people who actually have something constructive to put forward. And that's particularly what I think is needed today, is that, it's great to be able to go out there and criticize and destroy and bring down. Much more difficult to create interesting solutions to the problems that we face in the Middle East. And that's what, I enjoy when watching the Arab media.
Mm-hmm. So, but since the Arab Spring, Arab media outlets have been associated with their government sponsors to a point where they've almost become political actors, haven't they? Or at least perceived as being political actors.
Yeah, I had a discussion with a prominent conservative MP in the UK, and he was all about freedom of speech and the way that the press must be free. And so I pointed out to him that his press was owned by an Australian American, and so in what sense was it free?
I wonder which Australian American you're referring to.
Well,
did he just recently get married?
He may have, yes.
All right.
So, I mean, for me, it's a big question. Somebody will own the media at some stage, and somebody will have an agenda. And you see that in some of the finest media that we have out there. And that's one of the things that for example, when I'm speaking to younger diplomats or Emiratis, it's when you're trying to form a worldview, take everything with a pinch of salt. You've really got to you have to know that everybody has an opinion and they are going to feed you that opinion. You need to be able to somehow triangulate.
But are some governments not basically using that to settle political scores with rivals in the region?
Settle political scores? No, I think it's actually a much grander objective than settling political scores. It's actually trying to create a set of worldviews and promote certain perspectives.
No, I mean in terms of, for instance, Al Jazeera, you had some of their reporters that were held, you had their offices closed in other countries. Is the region not going back to some of its old bad habits, except it's taking aim at media outlets?
Yeah, I don't think that it's possible anymore to really control it that much. You've got just the social media and kids in the streets taking videos. So I mean, in that sense, I don't think you can really control it.
As a diplomat, how important is it for you to appear on Arab media? Television, radio, giving interviews, etc.
This is something that it's evolving. The Emirates diplomatic kind of tradition has been fairly quietist. And it's in the next, we're expecting in the next couple of years to really begin to push more of an agenda of what the UAE is as an example for the rest of the Arab world. We always seem to be presented with the choice of authoritarian secular state or religious authority. And actually, what we've got here is a dynamic economy. We've got men and women in the workplace. We're taking all of the elements that, for example, you make up modern-day Libya, and we've actually created something constructive out of it. And so I think in that sense, what we will try to do is push that idea that there is something positive that does exist in the Middle East and that we can actually perhaps, through our example, demonstrate to others.
So how does it work? I mean, I know that you're keen to talk about some of the ministries, some of the more interesting ministries that have been created in this country, the Ministry for Happiness, et cetera. Is there a conscious strategy to get the word out? And if so, what is it?
I'm not sure that there's a conscious strategy right now to get the word out. I think the more interesting aspect of that is that we are facing our own society, and we're engaging with our own society in that sense. And so by categorizing youth as an issue, as a set of potentials, that's very important. And in that sense, again, we're responding to the Arab Spring. And I do know that I remember it was about 10 years ago when His Highness Sheikh Mohammed Rashid, Prime Minister, Vice President and Prime Minister, he made a statement to other Arab leaders and said, you've really got to respond to your people. You've really got to think about what is in their benefit. And I remember many people sort of laughed at this and said, this is not serious. And he's actually demonstrated in the last 10 years of his prime ministership that he's really the driving force of focusing on the new generation. And so I think he called it before the Arab Spring. And so in that sense, I think it's very, very important. Going forward, okay, so, Happiness, Minister of Happiness has made a kind of a splash globally. People are talking about it. She's a young woman. And happiness is not something that you associate with the Arab world. And so in that sense, I think it's going to be...
Why not?
Well, I leave that to the biased media to answer. But yeah, so happiness is a really interesting and strange concept, and I'm going to be very interested to see how it is developed as time goes by. And obviously you have the Ministry of Youth, but you also have the Ministry of Tolerance. And tolerance is a very interesting idea. It almost sets a minimum standards. I tolerate you, which means that I don't get too upset that we're in the same room together.
Well, that's a winning proposition in today's Middle East, isn't it? If you could just tolerate the other person, given all that's happening. But so talk to me a little bit about tolerance in that sense, because you are also very interested in the issue of extremism within religion and how it can be used very destructively. You have a book, in fact, coming out next January.
That's right.
And correct me, is the title Letters from a Muslim?
No, although perhaps it should be, but no, Letters to a Young Muslim.
Oh, then you could, maybe that could be the subtitle, Letters to a Young Muslim from a Muslim. But tell me, what is it about this in this book specifically,
Yeah.
you want to communicate what exactly? What thought?
Well, firstly, the first version of the book that I wrote was actually kind of a more academic construction of a moderate approach to the world as a Muslim. But when speaking to my editors, we came to the conclusion that actually it might be better to simplify the ideas and actually have a 15-year-old as the audience. And so I've basically taken the idea of my son, and I addressed my oldest son, and I tried to explain to him some of the issues that are taking place in the Middle East today, and some of the questions, for example, about religious authority. And as you know, religious authority, when I was a younger man, religious authority was fairly clear. Today, with the multiplicity of platforms for people to speak about Islam, I get the impression that there is no clear authority anymore. And so you have our support for Al-Azhar as a UAE government is extremely important in trying to re-establish that traditional authority. But going forward, there will be other forms of authority that need to be either challenged or supported.
So you're talking here about, for instance, Sunni Islam and Al-Azhar, and that religious kind of central authority is it's not anymore the only central authority. You have many voices.
I think, I mean, you know, in the way knowledge has fragmented across many disciplines, the same can be said for religious knowledge as well. And I'm always surprised by, you know, the appearance of a very popular young Western convert to Islam who is sitting on TV with a long beard telling us what Islam is all about and what we need to be doing, and why he would have any authority. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that authority has fragmented, and that actually gives an opportunity for the individual Muslim to take responsibility himself or herself.
And since we're at the Arab Media Forum, I mean, so much of these other sources of supposed authority over Islam are broadcast over social media.
Sure.
And things like that. And you're talking about just some random person with a beard basically telling followers, you know, this is what Islam is. What is happening in the religion, do you think, where some section of it now is veering perhaps toward a more extreme interpretation?
Yeah, actually, I think it's a very difficult philosophical issue. You know, is the extremism within the text, or is the extremism brought to the text by a particularly sick individual? And I'm more inclined to see that it is the individual that has a problem. And also there are certain constraints that are built within Islam that will allow you to say, this doesn't work, it doesn't make sense within the overall message. And the overall message is one of moderation. And you know, it's not a straightforward thing. People are thinking about this all the time. How do you convince somebody, other than you by using your authority as a great Muslim scholar, how do you actually convince somebody that, you know, the text says something, but actually it comes within a historical context, it came at a certain time, there are higher values, for example. And so, for example, I mean, I was watching a video a few days ago of a young man, and he was talking about the use of certain emoticons, and how the emoticon for the angel was haram for one reason, because, you know, it's a symbol of...
Where was this debate being?
It was taking place on my computer.
Okay, I thought there was some show on emoticon today.
But he was inconsistent even in describing the emoticon. He took the angel emoticon and said that this is a Christian symbol, we shouldn't use it because it's a foreign. And he took the emoticon for the devil and said, well, because we don't know what the devil looks like, then we cannot represent him. So I thought, well, now he's all of a sudden defending the rights of the devil to to avoid misrepresentation. So this kind of massive philosophical confusion right at the heart of, you know, the kinds of debates that we have is very, very important.
And a lot of that is also had over social media, and some of them are more interesting than others, some of them are more amusing than others. But in your position as a representative of the UAE, how much do you use social media? How important is it for you?
In my job in Russia, it has been of minimal importance because Russia doesn't operate in kind of that kind of open way. It's been much more important meeting the right person at the right time and having the right conversation. Now, as we go forward, it may actually change. You know, there is the idea of actually cooperating or working with Russia on the issue of radical Islam. And they do have a very big problem, for example. And so that might be one of the entry points that the Gulf states and the Arab states in general could have into having a better relationship with Russia. And if you look at the way certain groups within Russia deal with Islam, I mean, as in the Caucasus area, you really need to begin to reach out to them. And as Arabs who have a...
But what do you mean reach out to them? You think, from what you've been saying, it sounds like you're saying Russians are misunderstood, their message is being distorted, they're not being treated fairly, their main concern is radical Islam. Have we completely just not understood what Russia is about? It's actually just...
No, I'm not saying that Russia is not being treated fairly. I don't think fairness has anything to do with it. If you want to solve a problem, it's probably best not to start off by insulting the person who you're going to solve the problem with, just as an idea. It's also probably better to get a real understanding of how power works and how opinion is formed.
So you're saying Russia is being insulted before it's being engaged in conversation? Is that fair then?
Kind of, yeah. Just as an example, when President Obama spoke at the UN, I think it was last year, and he named the 3 great threats to world peace, ISIS, Ebola, and Russia. The Russians can say, okay, we're being treated the same way. It's an odd combination. It's an odd trinity, I'd say.
Okay, so we spoke of Western media, we spoke of Arab media, but how about Russian media? What could be improved there? Because you could argue in exactly the same way that you have a lot of distortions and media biases there as well. I mean, I don't speak Russian, but I can read English translations.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a great circus. It's a lot of fun. They have these very, very aggressive debates. There's this one particular American journalist who insists on taking a beating every night on the TV shows, on the chat shows, and he defends the U.S. position, and he is torn apart by the nationalists and the more sort of pro-Russia groups. But what I'm saying is that you've at least got to listen to the argument. The arguments are actually very important. They can't be completely disregarded.
So as a diplomat, essentially, if I'm going to boil down your message, and we have 5 minutes left, and by the way, before we get to my summary of the ambassador's position, which will be probably reductive, but I'll do my best. There's 5 minutes left, so if anyone would like to ask a question, and I see a gentleman here in the front row, we will get to this gentleman in a moment, but I think we need a microphone to come to you first, right? And then we have another one. We won't have time for more than one, I don't think, because we're 3.5 minutes out. But if I'm to sum up your position as a diplomat, best not to insult your interlocutor before you start speaking to them, and perhaps maybe open dialogue and increased dialogue will lead to a better and kinder world. I don't think many people would disagree with you on that one. It's this gentleman here in the front row who has his hands raised next to the lady wearing the gray top. There you go. And if you could introduce yourself with your name first, please, and your question.
Abdullah Al-Madani from Bahrain. Mr. Ambassador, I believe you speak beside Arabic, English, and Russian, French, Italian, and Spanish. How did you find, or how have you found these media comparing to British and American in terms of reflecting opinion over Middle Eastern issues?
So I'm sorry, are you asking how he finds French, Spanish, which other languages?
Italian.
And Italian, compared to the other ones we discussed. Yeah.
To be honest, I don't really follow the media that much in those languages. Italian TV and Italian newspapers tend to be much more focused on the internal situation. So I didn't really get into that. For me, the critical sort of fields that I work in, so the Russian Russian environment, the Arab environment, and then obviously Western European, the decision makers, and that's pretty much Washington. So the way they look at the world is extremely important for me. But also the way they look at us. I mean, I remember speaking to this guy at a think tank in DC a few weeks ago. And I was talking to him about the possible common interests between the Emirates and Russia. And he misunderstood me, and he said, what common interests do the three of us have? And I said, no, I mean just the Emirates and Russia. And he said, how do you have interests that are different from our interests? So, there again, we've been constructed in a certain way. As appendages of the West, and the Russians will view us in the same way as well. It's been a long process trying to educate the Russians that actually the states of the Gulf are independent, even if they're linked to the dollar system, and there's a great interdependence. That actually politically there is a sovereign will that is at work.
All right, Ambassador, thank you very much. I'm told we have to wrap it up, so I apologize to that gentleman there for not being able to get to his question. Thank you, Ambassador Omar Ghobash, and to all of you for being with us in the audience as well. It's been really interesting. Half an hour flies by.
Thank you very much.
In a flash, doesn't it? Thank you again, and thank you to the Ambassador.
Thank you.